Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
I'm willing to take it a step further and say, okay, well, we could imply this.
Forgive me for laughing. No, this is actually really good because I feel, and again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I feel like there's memes. We've entered meme territory here in terms of the conversation, and we spoke off air about memes and people sending you memes on Twitter to try and debunk you and so on. But there is that meme of the Christian apologist, you, saying to the atheist, well, you know, you can't prove reality is real, therefore I'm entitled to believe in God. And that's that's not obviously the fairest summary of your position, but if you really break down what you've just said there, Dry Apologist, to one extent or another, you're saying that I'm being inconsistent because I believe in a real reality, and that's a kind of an a priori commitment, and yet I don't believe in God along a priori lines, and so therefore I'm being inconsistent. The problem I have with that, and the problem many atheists who are probably screaming at the screen right now after you've said that, the problem with that is that...
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month, and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. Up for today is part 2 of my debate with Dry Apologist, the Christian apologist who runs the Twitter page and YouTube channel of the same name. And yes, you heard that right. This is part 2 of a debate and or discussion. So if you missed part 1, make sure you check that out. It's available on the channel right now. With that said, in this second part, Dry Apologist and I discuss the existence of God with specific reference to the argument from contingency, an argument which seeks to demonstrate the existence of God with reference to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? So if that intrigues you, we're going to get into it in this conversation, but viewer discretion is advised. This conversation is complex and technical, so make sure you put your philosophical hat on. One other funny thing to make you aware of is this conversation actually took place over 2 sessions. We sat down and we had the conversation about the contingency argument, and then we parted ways, and it went to the following day. But both Dry Apologist and I felt so strongly about the discussion, and having exchanged messages on Twitter in between, we actually sat down a second time to continue discussing our disagreement. So at about the halfway point in this conversation, the background is going to change, right? Because we actually sat down twice. We sat down twice because our philosophical appetite was so grand that one conversation wasn't enough. So I want to extend an extra special thank you to Dry Apologist, who joined me not once, but twice in order to discuss the argument from contingency. So with all that said and out of the way, guys, this really is a philosophical feast that I hope you enjoy. And without further ado, I give you, once again, Dry Apologist. Take it where you want to go, my friend. What argument would you like to discuss?
Okay. So the two sort of reasonings that, at least we're just talking about God, so we're not getting into Christianity in particular, but that I find, compelling. One of them I'm not going to be able to share because it's personal. It's, religious experience does play a role, and that's going to be through prayer and the sacraments and such, and that's not going to be something I'm going to be able to share. It's just something I experience, but I recognize that does play a role. for me. But the argument that I really like, that I've debated a number of times and have studied and a decent amount, and I try to hone the details on, is argument from contingency, which you've probably come across before. But
Sure, yeah.
a lot of people in apologetics and counter-apologetics, often they don't come across the argument as much because the kalam gets a lot of the focus.
Yes, you're referring to Aquinas's third way, right?
Yeah, so that's a version of it, yeah. And then like Leibniz, there's lots of versions.
Leibniz has a version as well, yes, of course. Yeah, there's lots of different versions. Forgive me for cutting across. Yeah. I just wanted to make clear, I was just mentioning a version that I've looked at. I formally studied Aquinas's third way, but that's the one I'm most familiar with. But as you quite rightly pointed out, there are many versions, and you, if I'm not mistaken, have come up with your own version, and there are many other apologists who've done the same.
Yeah. I mean, there could be, upwards of 50 or more versions. They all take the same general approach. So, and basically, it's getting at like, why is there something rather than nothing, or what is it that is undergirding everything? And their argument's going to be that that's God, and of course that's going to be debatable. But the way that I like to, or at least a way I like to frame the argument is, and I'm just going to read it, and then we could kind of dissect it. So
sure.
And I will define terms as I go, just to make sure that we're on the same page. So when I'm using the word necessary, I just mean something that's like uncaused and it exists due to its nature. So it's not something that's existing due to something else. It's something that, is an uncaused thing that has to exist just given its own necessary nature, kind of like the way we might think of like the number one, but it's a little bit different. So a necessary foundation best accounts for the existence of structured reality. And by structured reality, I just mean that reality is interconnected. So things are causally interconnected. Like I can, move my mouse on my computer, there's laws of physics and so on. So it seems like a plausible inference that there's some kind of causal interaction to reality. And I'm going to argue that a necessary foundation is the best account for that. And I'll get why in just a second. And then the next premise is a necessary foundation cannot be externally or internally limited. And by that, I just mean there's nothing that's going to be outside of the foundation, this necessary thing that's going to limit or constrain it. And that's because it's an uncaused thing. It's the bedrock of reality. But I'm also going to argue that there's nothing inside of the necessary thing limiting it either. And I'll get to why in just a second. And then the next step is a necessary foundation that's not externally or internally limited is God. So that's just going to be a definition. I'm just going to say a necessary foundation that's not externally or internally limited is God. That's just how I'm defining God. And then the conclusion follows. Therefore, God best accounts for the existence of the structured reality. So the conclusion would follow, and the third premise is just a definition. So the controversial premises are going to be premises 1 and 2, and then what we can draw from 1 and 2. So I want to give, and hopefully that makes enough sense to you and the audience, because I recognize these types of arguments can get kind of abstract and certainly controversial. I don't act like this is going to necessarily convince somebody. It's just something that is like a project that I find compelling. So do you have any questions though so far? Because I want to define things a little bit further, but I don't want to get too confusing or whatever.
We can get into the definitions as we go, but I would really appreciate if you would just actually repeat premise 1.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, so let me go through premise 1 and then kind of give a defense of it. So a necessary foundation best accounts for the existence of our structured reality. So I'll go through and define the term. So necessary foundation, again, by that I just mean an uncaused thing, or you at this point you could even say set of things that exist due to its own nature, or due to their own nature, and then best accounts for, that just means is the best explanation for, and then of structured reality. And by that I just mean a reality where things have some kind of causal connection, like I can causally affect something. I can hit a baseball or turn on the TV. There's space and time. It's a physical reality that can interact. So the reason why I think I think there's basically three options here for what accounts for the reality or structured reality. And one, somebody could say it's a necessary foundation. They could just grant this premise, but then say that's not God, and we could move on to premise two. Or they could say it's a contingent foundation. And by contingent, that would mean something that it's not made to exist by something else, but it could have failed to exist. So it's here, but it didn't have to be. There could have been nothing. And that's certainly, I'm not going to say that's an unreasonable response. Like there are lots of philosophers who argue that, and even some theists argue that that's not unreasonable. But intuitively, it just seems less plausible to my mind. So there are some atheists, like, I won't list names, but there are some atheists who will grant a necessary foundation. So this is a premise that atheists could accept. But the motivation here is just that it just seems more plausible, more likely in my mind that given that reality does seem causally interconnected, things can affect other things, even if there is some breakdown, like at the quantum level or what have you. It just seems like if reality at its fundamental was contingent, then everything could have been otherwise at the basic level. Like we could be living in a chaos world. We could be living in a world without physics at all. If there's something necessary, it seems like that it has to be, and then it can interconnect everything else. But if something at the bedrock was just purely contingent, I'm not going to say it's logically impossible for things to still be causally interconnected, but it seems like that would be almost like happenstance. It seems like we would be living in a rather lucky coincidental reality. And it's not to say it's impossible, but I think this points in favor of the necessary foundation hypothesis. Now, the third option would be that there's an infinite regress of things. However, I only throw that out. I don't think that's actually a third option, because then you could say, well, is that infinite regress necessary or contingent? But it is still an option, or even a circle of causes. But I still think you can ask, well, is that infinite regress or circle necessary or contingent itself? So I do think you're kind of back to the options that reality has a necessary foundation or a contingent foundation, even if that's an infinite number of things. And then I'm going to say, again, causal consistency and structure and such is going to point in favor of a necessary foundation, because otherwise it's going to be just happenstance that we have a causally connected reality. While if there's something necessary that has to exist given its own nature, it can then it's going to already exist, and it's going to already exist as the foundation of everything else. So it seems to plausibly follow it could connect everything, and you can get this structured reality. Whether God exists or not, you can be an atheist and accept this. It just seems like, to my mind, that points in its favor. So that's going to be my defense of premise one. But I recognize it's very intuitive. Somebody could just say, well, they don't accept that. So I'm not claiming it's a proof, but that's kind of where I'm going to go with premise one. Do you have questions on that, or do you want me to move on to premise two? Or?
I'm just going to dive in with some critiques right off the bat, if you don't mind.
Yeah, okay, sure.
So one of the big leaps here is you admit yourself that you're making a definitional move. You say that, oh, but this is what we just call God, right? So even if I just granted, let's just steelman the argument. I'm just going to accept that your argument is true for the next couple of minutes, right? There is, in fact, a non-contingent, non-limited being. And when I say being, I'm not granting agency or personhood. When I say being, I just mean entity, right? A non-contingent causal thing, whatever that is. Even if I grant the whole argument that there is this such a non-contingent cause of everything, it doesn't follow at all that that thing is God. It doesn't follow that that thing is an agent. It doesn't follow that that thing has a mind or a will. So that's what I'm not seeing in this argument. So like I could literally grant the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, that's where. Yeah. So that's where I want to get to premise two, and then you can bring that objection back, because premise two is going to do a lot of work here once I unpack it a little bit more.
Okay. Please go ahead.
So let me go. Yeah. So premise two, because I think once you'll see at least the move that I'm making. It's controversial, but you'll see it. So a necessary foundation cannot be externally or internally limited. So the reason why in premise 3 I'm going to call that God is because I'm going to argue that a necessary foundation that's not externally or internally limited is going to thereby then have the traditional divine attributes. And the reason why I think that is going to plausibly follow, and this isn't an argument that's totally unique to me, like Josh Rasmussen, for example, argues something similarly. So I've kind of drawn upon other people as well. And that doesn't mean it's right or not. It's just showing where I'm coming from. So something that doesn't have anything imposed around it. So externally, I think it's going to be the necessary foundation. It's plausibly not going to be spatially limited. So it's going to be, I think, plausibly aspatial, at least in some sense. So it's not going to be contained within space. It's not going to have diameters and such. And then it's also going to be not contained by time. Now, the nature of that's going to be up to depending upon the nature of time, but it's not going to be confined by time. So it's going to be spaceless and timeless in some sense if it's necessary and not externally limited. Now, the personal attributes are going to come in and are going to be derived from the next claim that it's not internally limited. So I'm going to argue that if something's not internally limited, and by internal I just mean things within its nature, so not something outside of it, but something within its nature. So if you're going to lack internal limits, then it's going to be, at least plausibly, unlimited in intelligence, because I'm going to say that's something has the capacity for, and it's going to be unlimited in, I'm going to argue, compassion, so because that would be another capacity that an intelligent agent, so if it's unlimited in intelligence and unlimited in compassion, then I'm going to argue that that's going to be and I'm at least close to omniscient or maximally intelligent. I'm not worried about the omni so much as just getting a personal being on here. So maximally intelligent and maximally compassionate being. So if you have some necessary foundation that is spaceless, timeless, maximally intelligent, maximally compassionate foundation of reality, I think that's a plausible enough conception to call that God. Now, the controversy will then be, do those attributes follow, and does a necessary foundation need to be externally and internally unlimited? But do you see, though, you probably don't agree with it, but do you see where I'm coming from, though?
I see where you're coming from, but when you talk about you refer to them as the traditional divine attributes, that's a nice phrase, but my ear hears that as what ignorant humans in the past thought God is, right? So human beings in the past decided that there must be some kind of a God, and this God would obviously be maximally powerful or all-powerful, or this God would obviously be very, very intelligent, if not all-knowing, omniscient. This God would obviously be maximally loving or all-loving or omnibenevolent. So what you've done is it seems to me that there's a lot of assertions going on here, right? And you by your own admission, you admitted that there's some rather intuitive elements to this, and I think that's in some cases what this is going to come down to, because my intuitions don't map on to the intuitions that you're espousing here. So I don't buy at all that even again, this is on the assumption that I'm granting your premises and that there is, or let's just say I'm not granting all your premises. I'm granting that there's a non-contingent entity at the beginning of all things, right? A non-contingent, an unmoved mover, if you will. I know.
Now, I do want to flag just for the audience. So when we talk about the beginning, so just to clarify, I'm not talking about like the beginning of the start of the universe, but like right now, like that there's an uncaused foundation to things right now. Now, an atheist might say, well, that's the universe or matter and energy, but the theist is going to say that that's God, keeping those things in existence. So I just
okay. So that's actually very important. So because there are different types of causation, right? Or there are different types of contingency, right? So there is the contingency in that my existence was contingent upon my parents meeting and giving birth to me, right? But if they were to now pass away, goodness forbid, I wouldn't cease to exist because I'm already here. Whereas there's another type of contingency where I've seen the example used where the heat or the light that comes from the sun, if the sun were to burn out, that heat and light would go away. That's a different kind of contingency. Right. It's kind of like a sustaining kind of contingency. Right. So are you saying, Caleb, that God is a sustainer of reality, that if God were to cease to exist right now, reality itself would cease to exist?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I believe both conceptions, that God, started everything, but also that he sustains it. But yeah, this argument is chiefly concerned with the latter, so the sustaining. So it could grant that maybe the universe has always existed, but God has always sustained it. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be my view, but like I'd be happy to grant that possibility. You're right. Yeah, it's the second view.
Okay, so how is that not an assertion? Right.
Yeah.
How can I, like, why can't I just say, well, sorry, Caleb, I don't buy that assertion. You've literally said that God sustains the universe. I mean, even if I granted this argument, it doesn't follow that God is the sustainer. I think this argument maybe gets you to, if it were true, there's lots of other problems which we'll get to, but even if it were true, I could buy how this argument could get you to the causal contingency that God got everything started. But this reality operates, in the infamous words of Simon Pierre Laplace, I think it was, that this reality operates without that assumption. The universe appears to operate without the assumption of a divine sustainer. I mean, just examine any physical part of the universe. My heart is beating right now. And I know through scientific inquiry and biology that my heart beats because there's energy in my body. There's energy in my body because I consume food, and that food is broken down into energy that my body uses. My heart pumps, and then the blood goes around it, and the blood flows through. Right? I'm not a biologist, clearly. That's the most ridiculous description of how a heart works ever. But that acknowledged, there is no reason to suppose that, let's imagine a deistic conception of God where God got everything started. And let's imagine it was a God that actually is mortal. Now, you might say that's actually an oxymoron, but I would argue that as soon as you start abandoning the omnis, you're already in the territory of conceding ground about whether or not God can live forever and so on and so forth. So let's imagine there was a God that got everything started.
Well, let me just flag
and then pissed off. Right?
Sorry, I want to flag real quick. Just for the audience, I don't abandon the omnis. I just think the argument could work if one, because there are some weird paradoxes that somebody could question. I just don't want to, I don't want to get into a debate about omnis. That's why I like to use the word maximal instead. I do think God is omni. I just don't want to debate the technicalities of it. But yeah, go ahead and finish what you were saying. And then
I was just saying, I mean, on a deistic assumption, if there was a God that got everything started and then either pissed off or died, there's no reason to suppose that my heart would stop beating, right? I'm not hearing a justification other than your assertion that, oh no, this being would have to just hold everything together, and that your intuition tells you that. Well, my intuition doesn't tell me that, and I don't see a demonstration that there is a sustainer, right? I mean, could you speak to that? I mean, how are you getting to this, all not all knowing, but maximally knowing, maximally powerful sustainer? How are you justifying the assertion that God is here right now, sustaining this very moment as well as all other moments in space-time?
Sure. Yeah, and would it be something that would be an empirical demonstration? I wouldn't be able to say, oh, well, look, like if you get the microscope down, beyond the quarks, you're going to see God down there. Like, it wouldn't be like that. Okay. But it would be more, if you think that a necessary. So if you think like space-time, for example, is necessary, like, space-time has always existed, or, it has to exist, like, in any type of reality, that would just be the most fundamental thing. And it just, there couldn't have been nothing because space-time or matter and energy or a quantum field or whatever, naturalistic type hypothesis, it just has to be. So there are some atheist philosophers who will argue that they'll grant that there's a necessary foundation, but they'll just say it's like space-time or matter and energy. And then, so I'm going to say it's God, but I'm going to say, like, I need to argue a little more to get there. But if somebody agrees with that, and I recognize it's controversial, but if they agree that there's something uncaused at the foundation of reality, whether it's space-time or whatever, that would be enough to get to a kind of sustainer. We would then just need to then the debate would be, well, what attributes does that sustainer have? So by sustainer, I just mean the uncaused thing that is undergirding everything else. So you might say that's space-time or matter and energy, but I would say, well, maybe there's something beyond that that's keeping those things afloat. But even if somebody, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, I didn't hear in there a justification, though, Caleb. What I heard you say was that, oh, well, look, some people have the presupposition that it's just matter and energy. I'm just going to say that it's God. I mean, I'm not, all I really heard you do there, unless I missed it now, and if I missed it, please correct me, but all I really heard you do there was reassert your presupposition that there is a non-contingent being you call God that explains and sustains everything. Yeah, I'm aware that there are atheist philosophers and the like who will say that matter and energy are the non-contingent thing, and that the past is in fact infinite, which is something that we'll get to in a moment, because I'm more sympathetic to that view, truth be told. But my honest answer, I say sympathetic, I'm choosing my words very carefully. My answer is, I don't know, Caleb. I don't know why there is something rather than nothing. And I'm not convinced that anybody else knows either. And all I'm hearing from you here, with the greatest of respect, all I'm hearing from you here is a reassertion of the assertion you made a moment ago, about how your presupposition or your intuition is that, you think it's God, whereas others think it's matter and energy. Have I missed the evidential point you made? Did I miss the evidence or?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things, so I'll respond. Is that we say no. Well, again, we're talking about no. It depends upon what, so we're talking about epistemology. I wouldn't say I know God exists or I know God's a sustainer in like this 100%. I would say my rational leanings or justifications go in that direction. As you would, sounds like you would say, you wouldn't say God doesn't exist, but maybe your leanings go in that direction. So it's more of what you think is plausibly or likely the case rather than like 100% certain.
Yeah, I'm all about justified true belief. I'm not asking you to provide certainty here.
Okay.
I'm just looking to know why you, outside of just mere presupposition and assertion, and maybe this will go down the road of faith again. I don't know. But why do you have this presupposition that God is the non-contingent being?
Right. So there's two parts of the argument. So if you're going to take the route of you're totally on the fence, there could the foundation or bottom of reality is contingent or it's necessary and you really just don't know, then that would be a response, and then you could say that you're just not sure. But let's just say for a second that your rational leanings, you're justified, you are more plausibly convinced that there is something necessary. You just don't know what that necessary thing is. Then I would say, okay, well, then let's look at what attributes we think the necessary thing likely has. And then that's where I'm going to get to God from there. But
sure.
In terms, yes, so that's kind of, so yeah, I wouldn't say because there's a necessary thing, I'm just going to call that God. It's going to say, okay, there is a necessary thing. Okay, we can, or let's say if we agree on that, then let's move the debate on what we think that necessary thing's features are. And I'm going to say the features are going to be timeless, spaceless, maximally intelligent, maximally compassionate. And I'm going to try to give an argument for why I think that's the case. So there's a few more steps, and maybe, so yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, no, I understand where you're coming from. And William Lane Craig used a similar reasoning in his Kalam. After he gets to, therefore, the universe has a cause, he starts to hypothesize and speculate about the attributes and qualities of what this causal agent might actually be. And that seems to me to be what you're doing as well. I'm aware that the Kalam and that the contingency argument are separate arguments in the literature, but they're both still classified under cosmological arguments, right? And so it's not surprising that there would be some overlap here. It's when you start speculating towards the attributes is when we part ways in a significant manner. So you say that whatever caused the universe would be spaceless, it would be timeless, it would be immaterial. But all of that assumes that our universe emerged in such a manner. But it's not clear to me that you have ruled out the other possibilities, say naturalistic possibilities, right? The multiverse, for example. Now, I'm not saying I buy the multiverse, but for someone to make the claims you're making, you have to have ruled it out. Now, I'm not saying with certainty, and I'm not talking about certainty. I'm never talking about certainty. I hope I don't have to keep adding that caveat, but I'm just saying that you have to have some kind of evidentiary warrant or some kind of plausible explanation for ruling out multiverse, because maybe our universe emerged. Maybe our universe is a daughter universe that came from the multiverse. Now, you might say that just passes the buck, and then we'd have to ask, where does a multiverse come from? But if that's the case, we're stuck, because we're never going to be able to investigate that, being stuck within our local presentation of the universe, right? So there could be a multiverse, but then there's also this the past might very well be infinite, which is, it seems to me, something that has not been ruled out. And maybe that's the pathway we're going to go down here. Again, my answer is I don't know. The past might be infinite, it might be finite. People want to say that Big Bang cosmology closed the door on that conversation, but not even some of the world's best physicists believe that, right? I don't want to make an argument from authority. I just want to make the case that the jury is still out in terms of the question of cosmic origins or lack thereof. It might very well be the case that the past is infinite. I don't see any reason, intuitive or otherwise, why that option has been formally removed from the candidate explanations. I mean, I guess I've said enough there that you could respond to, Caleb.
Yeah, so the argument could grant these other, physical hypotheses about a multiverse or infinite past and such, because the question is going to be, what's the nature of the necessary foundation, assuming, when it grants a necessary foundation, because we could say, well, what's the nature of the necessary foundation of the infinitely past universe or of the multiverse? So it's going to, it's going to be independent of origins of the universe and more about the structure of causal reality. So
I think maybe we disagree then there. I think that's already a disagreement. So this is something that was broached by infamously by Bertrand Russell. I think it was in his radio debate with Frederick Copleston. And I think Hume also had a line on this, but basically, if the past is infinite and every contingent thing has another contingent thing that explains that contingent thing. So go to any point in time, go back a billion years, whatever that moment is there's a moment that precedes that. Go back another billion years, whatever's there's a moment that precedes that. And then your question is, but then what explains the whole series? But Bertrand Russell and Hume and others have pointed out that that's almost like a category error. I've got a little excerpt, actually. I'll just read this briefly. I really like this little anecdote here. It's from Gilbert Ryle. I'm sure you've encountered this before. Let me find it here now. I have it here. Yeah. So Ryle used the example of someone visiting a university and seeing many different colleges, libraries, and research laboratories. The visitor then asks, but where is the university? The answer, of course, is that there is no university over and above all of its component parts. I think that is what, to some extent or another, my suspicion, I won't say, I'm not going to charge you with this because I'm interested in your response, first of all, but my suspicion is that you're making a similar mistake. So I'm telling you that the past might very well be infinite, and then you're asking, but what explains that then? Well, each individual event is explained by the event that precedes it. Each individual contingent moment is explained by the contingent factors that come before it. The series doesn't need an explanation. The series is explained by each individual explanation that comes before each individual causal event that is contingent. It's just an entire series of contingent moments. And by explaining each of those, an infinity of them, you're explaining the series by doing it that way. You're then asking, like the person in the parable that Ryle articulated, after being shown all the individual parts, you're then saying, but where's the university though? And that seems to me to be the error that's at play here. But I want to give you a chance to respond to that, Caleb. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
First of all, does that make sense as a response to your position?
Yeah, I think that they are a little bit different though. So like Gilbert Ryle's category error, this fallacy that he is famous for articulating, that you can ask the wrong question about something. So like in his example, he was saying like you could study all the parts of the brain, and then somebody could say, yeah, but where's the mind? And he's saying, well, the brain is the mind, and at least within his argument. And then something like it'd be like somebody going to a university and saying like, well, I saw the library and the stadium and classrooms, but where's the university? And the idea is, well, the university is the word we use for all those buildings. Now, somebody could say that about the universe. They could say like, well, look, we have this, the space-time and matter and energy and the infinite past and so on. And somebody could say, yeah, but where's the necessary thing? And you could say, well, that's the necessary thing. Or somebody could say, where's the necessary thing? And they could say, well, we just have an infinite number of contingent things. However, I think that would just then invite that next question. So like with Hume, he did argue something along the lines of like, well, each contingent thing is explained by another contingent thing, and so on to infinity. And that's to me, that's the more key objection here. And I would still say though, to me, that's not going to be satisfying, because it's going to invite, I can grant that each thing's temporal, as in like its past origin, is explained by a prior state, even onto infinity. I'm happy to grant that, but it still wouldn't get down to what's the nature of what's necessary in reality. And if there is a necessary foundation, I'm going to want to get at its attributes. And there could be an infinite series of contingent things or an infinite series of necessary things, but I'm going to want to, if there is a necessary thing at all, what do its attributes need to be? And I'm going to say they need to be divine attributes. And I understand that that's where a lot of the debate's going to go.
Sure, but then aren't you risking hypothesizing about something that just doesn't exist? Because, right, if it is just an infinite series of contingent things, then we wouldn't need this non-contingent entity that you're then hypothesizing about in terms of its qualities. Do you not see where I'm coming from there?
Yeah, if you argue that there's just contingent things, that would, if you think that's the correct view, that would undercut this argument.
Yeah.
But I don't think. Right, so I don't.
How do you rule that out? Is my question. Yeah, how have you ruled out an infinite past of contingent things? How have you formally ruled that out? Not with certainty, remember. Just I want to know your explanation as to why that is off the table.
Right. So I want to make clear though that I can grant that there's an infinite past of contingent things. The question though is the foundation of reality contingent or necessary? Because that's really what the argument's getting at. Whatever the foundational, the bottom uncaused structure of reality, whether that's space-time, matter, and energy, there could be an infinite series of each one interacting with each other, but that the core fundamental component of reality, that's like the structure that makes up reality, that's the uncaused threads of reality, whatever you want to call it, is that aspect contingent, or is that aspect necessary? Now, if you say it's contingent, I agree that would undermine this argument. But if it's necessary, then you can keep going with the argument. Now, the argument that I'm giving for why I think the necessary foundation is the better interpretation is that it's better able to explain how we have a causally connected reality at all. If it was purely contingent, there could have been no reality. It could have been chaos. It could have been, so it seems like it's less likely that we would have this causally interacting reality if it was purely contingent at the foundation. Now, I'm not the only person that makes the argument, and I'm not saying it's necessarily convincing to everybody, but that's kind of the line of reasoning. Now, sometimes people argue, well, there would be no explanation, and we always need an explanation for things. And I'm not as fond of that route. I like this other route about explaining causal consistency and such. But what do you think about that approach?
Yeah, it's a strange response. It feels like when you're asking, yeah, but what's the foundation of the infinite series of contingent causes? I feel like you're making the mistake that Hume was accusing theists of making. I feel like you're just restating the mistake. If it is just an infinite chain of contingent events, then there doesn't need to be another explanation. You keep saying, but what's the foundation of it? I feel like you're just restating it as
I guess a better way to say is, why isn't that chain just pure chaos? Why is there a causal structure to reality at all? And saying, well, there's an infinite chain of causal things wouldn't explain that deeper question.
I don't know. I don't know why reality operates neatly according to laws of physics and causal principles. I just don't feel like hypothesizing about things that might exist outside of space and time, something which is already a rather ludicrous and incoherent concept. How could something exist outside of space and time? And then your response, to put it in a more rudimentary form, is yes, but God is magic, so God can exist outside of space and time.
Because the atheist could grant that there's the necessary foundation. They could say, yeah, space-time is necessary foundation, and it explains why we have this causal structure to reality, but they don't think it's a personal being. So that would be, and I have atheist friends that's where they'll part ways maybe with the argument.
But I would just say that they don't know that either. Like
we don't know it.
No. I keep saying the word no.
I know.
When I say I don't know, when I say they don't know, I just mean that they don't have good. They don't have, in my view, sufficient enough justification to make that claim. That's all I mean. Just to be clear, I should say that now because we've tripped over this a couple of times and it's my mistake. It's not yours. Anytime I say that they don't know or I don't know or you don't know, I'm not saying that I'm not accusing you of not having 100% certainty. All I'm saying, when I say I don't know, I just mean that you don't have justification to believe that. So when you refer to your atheist friends who tell you, oh, well, I just believe that the necessary thing is the universe or is space-time or something of that nature, I'm saying that those beliefs are also not necessarily justified. What I'm saying is that we're stuck. I think the only honest answer here is to say that there's some very interesting hypotheses about origins, about why there is something rather than nothing, but we're not even so sure if that's a good question. Maybe there was just always something. Maybe there was, in fact, nothing at some point at T0 or before T0. What I'm saying is that there are lots of interesting hypotheses, but that there's not really a good justification to adopt any of them and to say that this is a defensible position. I think the only fair thing to do at this point or at this juncture is to suspend judgment. But that's obviously not what you're doing. Does that make sense in terms of what I'm saying, Caleb?
Yeah, it does. Now, I will say, though, that any dispute, like any disagreement or debate, is going to get to a point where somebody is going to draw upon, like, well, this seems plausible, so like I accept that there's a real external world around me, not with 100% certainty, but it seems justified. So to me, the necessary foundation hypothesis seems like that. Now, to you, it may not, but it's hard to say if somebody's saying, like, well, look, this really seems like a better explanation. I really think I should put my rational weight behind it. Somebody else may be justified in not going that route, but it's hard to say what's necessarily justified or not when you get down to like the nitty gritties. So I recognize there are intuitions at play, but I would still defend that those intuitions can be justified.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a whole bunch of questions written down here. I've been scribbling and typing and doing all sorts of things. So let's I'm just going to run with the pathway because you're right. It does come to a point in the conversation where you have to kind of maybe expose your leanings. And I've already admitted that I'm sympathetic to the view that the universe might actually be the necessary thing, right? So let's just go with that for the sake of conversation, right? Why, or rather, how have you eliminated that as an option? Again, not with certainty, but how do you remove that as a candidate explanation from the pool of explanations? Why can't the universe be the non-contingent thing?
Sure. So at premise one of the argument, the universe has not been ruled out, of course. So premise one is just saying, is arguing for a necessary foundation. So then, assuming if somebody grants that, then you can move on, to premise two and say, well, the necessary foundation can't be externally or internally limited. Now, let's say somebody who takes the the idea of space-time as being the necessary foundation, and maybe they'll grant, okay, space-time's not externally limited, but that's still not God, and I would agree. So it really then comes down to this lack of internal limitations, and again, that would be a limitation within something's nature. And to me, an impersonal space-time is limited from not being maximally intelligent and not having the further psychological features that would come with that. So
and my response is, so what? My response is, so what? Who cares, right? Why would the non-contingent foundation of reality have to be as you describe? Why does it have to have an unlimited internal and external quality?
Yeah, well, the external one is a little easier, I think, to come by. So, like, there's nothing outside of it because it's necessary. It's that final stopping point. There's nothing that's going to exist around it to limit it. So it's going to plausibly, be externally limited. So it's not going to be confined by space and time. Now, again, what that means exactly could still be open for further exploration, but it's not going to have space and time around it. And that would seem to just plausibly follow there, although somebody could perhaps push back. But the internal one is where it's going to get more controversial, and that's where it's going to start pushing, going towards God if one accepts that. And there are several lines of reasoning I'm going to use to try to get there. And I recognize, again, it's controversial, but so the idea would be there's nothing. So there would be several ways that these internal limitations could arise, and I'm going to say that none of them can apply with the necessary foundation. So the internal limitations could be imposed from the outside. Well, there's nothing outside of the necessary foundation, so I think logically that's going to get ruled out. The internal limitations could be applied by the necessary foundation, but it's going to be too late for that. The necessary foundation exists. It has to exist. It's not going to be able to then decide its attributes, or these internal limitations are going to be logically necessary. So they're going to be, they just have to be that way. But they're not logically necessary, because I can always ask, well, why is it limited to this degree and not another degree and not another degree? So it's not a logical necessity. So to me, those options seem to be ruled out. So the final option one could appeal to is to say, well, it's just metaphysically necessary, like it just is that way, and we want a further explanation beyond that, but there just isn't one. But to me, that's not going to be viable either, because the only metaphysical limitations all extend from the metaphysically necessary foundation itself, because it's this foundation for reality. But again, it already exists. It doesn't decide its own attributes. So there is going to be nothing. There's not going to, so logic or physics or outside causes, there's going to be nothing to infuse these internal limitations. So being unlimited is just going to be its default state. So I recognize that's a lot.
Yeah, Caleb, it's a lot, but it's also very abstract. Let me hone this with a simple question, and this will hopefully bear some fruit. Please give me an example of a limitation that physical reality has that renders it useless as a candidate explanation for the non-contingent foundation. Give me an example of a limitation that it has that makes it inappropriate as a candidate explanation for the foundation.
Yes. So when we're talking about fundamentality, it's not ruled out in that regard. So like space-time as a cause, it does work as a hypothesis. So somebody says, oh, well, what's the necessary foundation of space-time? There's nothing incoherent about that. But it's when you conceptually unpack the type of whether or not the necessary foundation needs limitations or not, I think then the logic goes towards there just is nothing that can account for why it would have limitations. So it's more of a deduction.
Why couldn't a non-contingent foundation have limitations?
No, because the only we're looking at the logical canvas of ways that these limitations would be introduced. So from the outside, the foundation introducing the limitations within itself, well, it already exists. or logically necessary, like 1 + 1 = 2. It's just mathematically necessary. Well, it's not that, because we can think of all kinds of different ways it could have been limited. So no set of limitations is mathematically or analytically necessary. And those are just that is the canvas. The only other option is metaphysical necessity, but metaphysical necessity comes from the metaphysically necessary foundation. So again, it's too late. It's too late. So all these options are either ruled out as just false, or they're too late to the game. So the default is that it's unlimited in all regards, unless the feature itself requires a limitation. So if somebody asks me, well, it's not made of wood, that's a limitation, but being made of wood requires being externally limited by space. So that's ruled out. But so any feature that requires a limitation, it wouldn't have. But if it's not something like that, it's going to be unlimited.
Yeah, I'm just I might be missing the point here, but
okay. And it is, I acknowledge, it's totally abstracted. It's not. This isn't everybody's cup of tea. This is like a project that I like, and I recognize this won't appeal to many Christians and theists as well. So, but
I mean, it appeals to me. It appeals to me. I'm riveted by the conversation. I'm just at pains to understand the point you're making. So all I'm hearing is that all I'm hearing is your presupposition being reasserted. I mean, my question is why. So why can't reality just have been infinite, right? I don't know why we're getting into speculations about limited and unlimited, right? So why can't the non-contingent thing just literally be the universe as it exists, right? Now it changes over time, and planets form and suns die and falling stars and all that stuff, right? Fine. All that stuff happens over time. Why can't we just, if you just imagine the cosmos or universe, whatever terminology you want to use, is just a bubble. I know that has problems, because then what's outside the bubble? And okay, right, yeah, our understanding of reality breaks down when we start talking about this very abstract stuff. What I'm asking you is, why can't it just have been that this bubble exists infinitely, and you're going off on a very abstract soliloquy about, but limitations here, and it needs to be unlimited, and I just don't understand why any of that is necessary. Perhaps I'm just not well read enough. Perhaps I'm just out of my depth here. And if that's the case, perhaps you can refer me to an article or a book I need to read, and I will do that. But I'm just not. Basically, my point is, anything that can be claimed by the theist can also be claimed by the naturalist. And it seems to me that you're trying to set up arbitrary rules to prevent that from being the case. You, at the end of the day, believe in an infinitely existing God. If your God can be infinite, so can reality. You don't get to, otherwise it's just a special pleading fallacy. You don't get to claim and assert an infinitely existing God and bypass all of the other traditional norms and rules, and then hold my feet to the fire and tell me that I can't assert an infinitely existing universe. And again, remember, my official position is that none of these options have elevated to the point of justified true belief. As far as I'm concerned, the only honest thing to say is to put your hands up and say, well, you know what, I'm not sure how all of this got started and why there is something rather than nothing, or whether or not the past is infinite or finite. But, you're asserting the existence, I shouldn't say asserting, you're trying to demonstrate the existence of an infinitely existing, immaterial, spaceless agent that somehow has a mind, despite the fact that it doesn't have a brain, which is evidentially problematic. It's immaterial, and yet it interacts with physical reality and sustains it. There's all of these problems that are in your position, and all I'm trying to get you to concede is that it's possible that the past was infinite, is just infinite, and that, again, not true, but just it's possible that we could have an infinitely existing reality, and you're erecting these rules that, as far as I can tell, are arbitrary and rooted in your own intuitions and presuppositions about, whether or not space-time or a physical reality can in fact be the necessary foundation. I mean, again, assuming for a moment that I'm just an idiot, explain to me, like I'm 7, why my claim that an infinitely existing space-time cannot be a candidate explanation. Right, I've said a lot there, obviously, so I want to give you some time to respond, Caleb, but please go right ahead.
Well, I'm not going to be able to explain it to you like you're 7 because I don't think a 7-year-old is going to be able to fully understand.
It's just a turn of phrase. Just a turn of phrase.
Yeah.
I just mean simplify it as much as you can. Sure.
No, right. I know. And well, I have. It's just that at least as much as I can. So, yeah, a book I would point you towards that gives a similar argument, and you may have even read some of it or all of it. It's between an atheist and or an agnostic and theist philosopher. It's called "Is God the Best Explanation of Things?" between Dr. Josh Rasmussen and Dr. Felipe Leon. So Rasmussen is the Christian theist, and he gives an argument similar, although I put my own tweaks on it, and then Professor Leon pushes back in some ways similar to what you're doing. That's a book I'd recommend anybody who's interested in philosophy. It's a little bit difficult, but it's not. Somebody who's interested could definitely get through it. It's a dialogue book, it's kind of like what we're doing. So I highly recommend that book.
Sure.
It's probably the best book out there between an atheist, theist that I definitely recommend people read. So yeah, Professor Rasmussen goes through a similar kind of argument. So that would be the reading recommendation I would give. But yeah, the idea though that the universe, and again, just to repeat, that book is called "Is God the Best Explanation of Things?" And people can find that online. But so the universe going back infinitely, though, that is, yeah, I grant that. It's that's a possibility. And as far as I know, that's not necessarily even ruled out. Like, it's not my preferred conception, but like God could have, like Aquinas and a number of people have argued, yeah, God could have created the universe like that if he chose. He could create a universe with a infinite past time. It's really, but what is the nature of the necessary foundation? And I don't require somebody to reach this conclusion if their intuitions don't go in this direction. But to me, once somebody grants a necessary foundation, it is a applicable question to ask: does the necessary foundation have limits or not? And again, to me, there are two types of limits: ones that are imposed and ones that are within something's nature. And those are just the only two types of limitations that there can be. And there's just nothing that can introduce the limitations for the necessary foundation, because there's nothing outside of it. And all the other options are ruled out either conceptually or, conceptually. So there's nothing outside to infuse these limits. The nature of the foundation's too late to the game to infuse it, and no set of limitations is logically necessary. So to me, the foundation is thereby unlimited. Now, that's not to say somebody thereby is like, oh, you've proven it, game over. I'm not claiming that. That's just, to me, though, I find that pretty plausible. And that does point me towards belief in God. But I freely admit, I already had belief in God, and that is a, bias that I have. I already lean in that direction. So I'm already going to be like, hey, boom, like I like that argument. But in fairness to me, there are a lot of arguments for God that I'll go, no, that doesn't work. And I'll explain exactly why it doesn't work. And I'll even tell other theists that, if they ask, that they're wrong. So I do. So hopefully that kind of explains where I'm coming from, but go ahead.
It's helpful. So two things. Okay. You said God could have created the universe in a form where it has an infinite past. Isn't that an incoherent statement? How can something be created? That to my mind infers that it didn't exist at some point and now it does. And yet you said God could have created a physical reality that has an infinite past. That seems to me to be entirely incoherent. I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Sure. So it depends upon what definition of create. So if by create somebody means has a temporally finite starting point, like there's a T0, T then T1, then yeah, that would be incoherent because it wouldn't have an infinite past. But if by create one simply means gives existence to, then and that's kind of a broader term of definition of creation that's also been used. So as long as God is the reason why something exists, then it seems like it could be coherent that God could be holding up in like an infinite timeline, and he's always been doing that. He's not, being outside of time. He's just always there, keeping this infinite timeline in existence, and that infinite timeline's always been there. But God is still the sustaining cause of it. And if you're using that broader definition of create, then it seems coherent to my mind.
But then God and the universe are synonymous, right? So
well, no, because they'd have different attributes. So the universe would still exist because of God, like you were saying earlier, like the light exists because of the sun, but God would have attributes the universe doesn't have. The universe wouldn't be a maximally thinking, compassionate being, and so on. So they would be distinct. And
sure,
yes,
but
they would both always exist. Yeah.
Yeah, but if they've both always existed, then yeah, maybe we're having a semantic disagreement about the word create, because you're talking about a sustainer model. It just, yeah, that's what I was reacting to. So I guess
it depends upon the definition of create. So yeah, some people will say by create they mean a starting point like time t1, and I agree that would be ruled out. But if by create you just mean is the reason why something exists or is a sustainer, then it would seem compatible.
Okay, so you acknowledge that an unlimited reality, or an unlimited rather physical reality as a foundation is a possibility. Do you acknowledge that it's a possibility that there's an unlimited, or rather infinitely existing physical reality without a God? Do you acknowledge that as a possibility in the candidate
sure,
list?
It's a logical possibility, and it's one meaning there's nothing incoherent about it, and it's one that somebody could defend. So I grant, I mean, there are very capable, smart atheists who could defend that position. I wouldn't say they're irrational, but my rational leanings lean away from that view. Like, I don't think it seems correct, but I wouldn't say somebody is stupid or illogical or whatever irrational if they thought that was the better view. So
okay, so that brings me to my final question then, on this particular argument, which is how do you spoke about limits and the lack thereof, right? And your claim is that, assuming there is a non-contingent foundation to reality for a moment, your claim is that non-contingent being would have to be unlimited, or not have any internal or external limits. So that raises huge questions. How do you know anything about the nature of this God that you're suggesting? How could you possibly know anything about what its limits are or aren't? How could you possibly know that? I guess is the question. Because I feel like we've discussed the rest of it enough that the viewer can make up their own mind about whether or not it's persuasive. And as you inferred, perhaps this comes down to one's, you seem to already agree that if you're an atheist, this might not be the most persuasive argument, and that might actually be better for someone who already has faith. At least it seemed to me like you inferred that at one point. If I'm mistaken there, you can correct the record. But how do you know anything about the characteristics of a being which you yourself admit is immaterial, spaceless, and timeless? I mean, I don't even know how you could know that necessarily about the being. I know you say that whatever caused the universe would exist outside of space and time, so therefore it must be spaceless time. But yeah, is that it? Is that basically how you're discharging those principles? You're saying that God is spaceless, time is an immaterial just because he exists outside of space and time. Is that the argument? I just want to make sure that I've understood that.
So excuse me. It's a conceptual kind of deduction. So one could still have debates about the nature of that. So like there are some theists who argue that God is in time in some sense, and that would be a separate debate. But yeah, like I would say conceptually, something's a necessary foundation. It's not going to be surrounded by space and time because it's going to be, there's going to be nothing external to it. So yeah, it's a conceptual kind of deduction. So yeah, that now to your further question, how do we really know God? I mean, one can look at an argument like this and be like, okay, yeah, that's plausible, but it's not going to tell you a lot about, even if they're convinced by the argument, it's going to get them to a generic kind of conceptual analysis. So like Aristotle gave like a similar kind of argument, and that's kind of like what Aquinas was drawn upon and such, but it's not like Aristotle was thereby a Christian. It's like this is more of like a metaphysical thesis. So then further information, of course, is going to come from being convicted by a religious tradition. And I do think other religions practitioners can have a real relation with God. I just don't think that they have all the correct theology. But I think if they're praying and such and contemplating like they are, can be in real contact with God, I just don't think all of their the historical and theological ideas about God are correct. And not all Christians' views are correct either, because obviously I disagree with other Christians on things. But yeah, that's going to come from reading scripture and following church teachings and such, and there's going to be a degree of faith involved. But now I do want to. So you did bring up the idea that the argument may not be convincing to an atheist. So that probably is going to be the case, because people do tend to fall back on their beliefs. I would say on both sides. Now an argument could though convince somebody, like at one time I wasn't aware of contingency arguments, and then I started studying them, and it did increase my confidence in theism, but I was already believing in theism. But and somebody in maybe the problem of evil, for example, has decreased my confidence in theism, because I think that's a powerful argument. So I try to formulate responses to then increase my confidence in theism. So I think arguments can have some force, but yeah, I mean, one argument's probably not gonna win the day for somebody. It's gonna be well, I could see that's reasonable, but I recognize it's not gonna be oh, you recite this argument and then somebody changes their mind. It's just not really how people tend to operate, including myself. So yeah, go ahead.
So extending an olive branch, I mean, and I'm on record saying this on my channel in the past, actually, if indeed there is something outside of space and time that caused space and time, I can buy that it's spaceless and timeless. By definition, actually, it's almost like a tautology. The place where we part ways, Caleb, is then you assert that this causal agent, and I say the word agent not to imply a person, but just causal entity, right? Maybe that'd be a better word. Then you assert that it's personal. Please explain. Why would the non-contingent foundation of reality have to be personal?
Sure. So I would say if it's not personal, then that's going to be an internal limitation. So
but see, we disagree there. Is that not an intuitional point? Wouldn't this being personal, couldn't someone legitimately argue that it having it being personal, that's a limitation?
I don't think so, because a limitation is going to be a lacking in any feature. So it's not. So if it lacks personhood, it lacks intelligence, it lacks compassion, and to me those are, any psychological component it's going to lack, then that's going to be a limitation in my mind. Now I'm not saying somebody couldn't push back on that, but to me it does seem to conceptually follow. If it's unlimited, it's going to be, lacking a personal attribute is going to be a limitation.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at odds, because what you're doing is articulating the existence of a mind in an immaterial, atemporal, and spaceless context, and that to me is entirely incoherent. You can talk about the logic of limitations all day long, but you are articulating something which the evidence seems to suggest is an impossibility. We don't have any evidence, Caleb, of minds that exist absent a brain, and a brain is a physically existing thing. And yet you're talking about a mind existing in a context of spacelessness, timelessness, and immateriality. I mean, do you have any justification for that? How can you justify a mind in that context?
Yeah, so obviously, we don't have empirical evidence of a spaceless, timeless mind. I mean, because that would go beyond something that we have direct contact with, at least I could provide. But I don't see any logical contradiction, though, in a spaceless, timeless mind, and that's where it's going to be. It would seem like it would need to be a logical contradiction. And I'm not saying you couldn't make an argument, but
I see. I think that's the difference between us, Caleb, because I'm actually very much on board the idea that logic, while useful, is not actually necessarily beneficial for determining reality. It's useful, don't get me wrong, but logic and logic alone. This is why I'm not a big fan, Caleb, of ontological arguments. I'm not a big fan of modal arguments. Modal arguments, for those who aren't aware, are arguments to do with possible worlds and so on. These are all arguments that are a priori, which is to say deal specifically with the realm of logic. There's all sorts of things, Caleb, that are logically possible. All sorts of things. I mean, unicorns are logically possible. There's nothing logically incoherent about the concept of a unicorn. The same is true about any other, I wouldn't say any other, but many other mythological and supernatural entities. So if your response to me is, oh, but it's logically possible that there's a mind in that scenario. Well, I mean, that's the easiest thing to grant ever, but that doesn't mean that it's actually the case. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so something being logically possible wouldn't make it the case. Like, I agree that like a unicorn is logically possible, but a unicorn doesn't exist as far as we know. But that's because a unicorn, we don't have an argument for a unicorn, or we don't, so somebody gave me, some deductive argument that there is a necessary unicorn, or a unicorn has to exist, and we would take a look at that. But I don't know of a good argument. And a unicorn being a being within the universe, if it exists, presumably would be on our planet. Or if that's the type of thing we're talking about, we have actually empirical reasons to think that's not true, but God exists outside of the empirical reality if he exists. So we don't have that kind of disconfirmation. But I'm not a fan of ontological arguments or arguments that deal with a modality. I don't like those arguments either, but it's not because that it's a priori in my mind. It's because I think there are some actual problematic commitments that they imply, but that would be a different discussion. But I don't have a problem in principle with an a priori argument. Like, for example, the cogito, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is an a priori argument for my existence, and I find it convincing. It's like I can doubt my own existence, but I can't doubt my own existence unless I exist. So I must exist. And that doesn't prove what type of being I am, but I find it a very compelling, a priori deductive logical argument that I have to exist. So in principle, I think an argument like that could work for God or anything. It's just most of them don't work. The cogito is one that most people probably are willing to grant. And some people argue that it's not a priori, but I would disagree with them. But yeah, I don't see why logic. It's definitely a starting point. I just accept that logic does apply to reality. But to me, that's more obvious than anything else that somebody would try to convince me with. So it's like, if someone wants to try to talk me out of it, they could try, but I'm probably not going to be. I haven't heard anything that's persuasive enough to talk me out of it. So yeah, I do start with that, but it's kind of like I accept the external world, even though I can't prove it.
Sure.
It's just so blindingly obvious.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to be misconstrued here. I'm a big proponent of the laws of logic and, law of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, and all those kinds of things. I think those are they have enormous utility, and they appear to be inviolable to one extent or another. But we're not just talking about we're not talking about the laws of logic. I'm talking about whether or not logic on its own can be used to demonstrate the existence of something. So this is why I don't like ontological arguments, because they attempt to do just that. They attempt to prove the existence of God using logic and logic alone, and I'm not convinced you can do that. I've never seen a demonstration that logic can prove the existence of something, of a physically existing entity, or even a metaphysically existing entity. Going back to the unicorn thing, though, you said you've never heard a good argument in favor of unicorns, right? And that, if they did exist, they would exist in physical reality, and so we would expect to find physical evidence of them, and so you think you have evidentiary warrant to disbelieve in unicorns. Now, I don't believe in them either, right? But somebody could say what you said. When I challenged you on the existence of a mind in a spaceless and timeless context, you said, but it's not logically impossible. Now, somebody articulating the unicorn hypothesis could make the exact same move, Caleb. They could say, well, and by the way, I would argue that we should expect to find physical evidence of God in our reality, and your religion and your Catholicism agrees with it, right? I mean, God literally, God, what I wouldn't say a kind of, Caleb, God literally came to earth in the form of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean we would. Yeah, but that doesn't mean we would have physical evidence right now, and also it wouldn't mean that people at that time knew that that was God either.
Sure, but you believe in a God that you believe in an interventionist God. You believe in a God. I'm going to quote Sam Harris here. You believe in a God that intervenes in our reality and answers prayer. In principle, that's detectable. You believe in a God that created the world. In principle, that's discoverable. And you would argue that you've discovered it using your argument here this evening, for example. But I would say in principle, it's discoverable even empirically. You believe in a God that created life. In principle, I mean, in principle, that's discoverable empirically. Your religion trespasses, if you forgive me for using a negative term there, but it trespasses explicitly into the domain of empiricism in many, many ways. So with the greatest of respect, Caleb, it's not at the level of principle different from the unicorn analogy. You walled off the unicorn analogy and said, oh, but unicorn analogy is I think I've good justification for not believing in unicorns because they exist in physical reality and we'd expect to find physical evidence and we haven't, and no one's ever given me an argument. But then someone in that exact same scenario could say, yeah, but even though there's no physical evidence, it's not logically impossible for a unicorn to exist. I fail to see how that is principally different from the response, the pivot that you made, Caleb, when I was trying to hold your feet to the fire on the existence of a mind in a spaceless and timeless context. Your response was to say, but it's not logically impossible for a God mind to exist in such a context. And I feel like you're making the exact same pivot there. Right. And I would stand by my claim that we would expect to find empirical evidence of your God in our reality if indeed your God existed. And to my knowledge, we have never found empirical evidence of your God, let alone any God. And so I really do. I'm going to try and hold your feet to the fire on this claim that a mind can exist in a spaceless and timeless context. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to produce empirical evidence for that because that's impossible. But in the absence of empirical evidence, if your only retort to me is to say, but it's not logically impossible, well, that's not very persuasive, I'm afraid. But I want to give you a chance to respond, my friend.
Yeah, so there's a few things there. So with the nature of the mind, of course, as we've talked about on Twitter, it's, a hot debate. So like I would say like a materialist, at least reductionist view of the mind, that like mind literally is just matter and energy. I find that incoherent, or at least I find it empirically just absurd. But I recognize there are prominent defenders of it, so it is a worthy debate. But in regards to where I want to go with this, the unicorn example is that the unicorn is something that we should expect to detect, like sensory run into. Now, if somebody wants to say they're talking about an invisible unicorn and it doesn't do things and stuff, okay, well then maybe not that. But if somebody's talking about a horse with a horn and it lives in the forest and we can see it and it runs around, well, we don't find that. But God could, and I think God does, work miracles within the world, but we wouldn't necessarily it wouldn't necessarily be obvious to our senses. So it'd be like the invisible unicorn. So yeah, it's possible there's an invisible unicorn running around, but I don't have reasons. So it's logically possible, but I don't have reasons to believe that. But with the empirical unicorn, like a horse I could find in a forest, well, yeah, I mean, people aren't finding those horses. So that's where the distinction is. It's like it's what kind of empirical evidence. So yeah, I do believe God works within nature to perform miracles, but I don't necessarily mean I would be able to detect it with my senses.
Sure. So are you saying then that your entire faith and your Catholic faith more specifically then, Caleb, you mentioned earlier about religious experience, which you're not going to get into. Fine, we'll wall that off. But
we can get into it. I'm just not going to be able to share it because it's just it's in.
Sure.
Well, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, are you saying that leaving that aside, leaving the religious experience bit aside for a moment, are you saying that the reason you believe in God is primarily based on a priori justifications? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at like philosophical arguments and we're setting aside, things like, religious experience or reading the Bible, we're just looking at like natural theology. So like arguments or something that like we could sit and hash out like we've done. Yeah, I would say something like, now, whether a contingency argument, I wouldn't say it's purely a priori because it is drawing upon observations about the universe like being causally regular. So it is a posteriori in that sense. But
Sure.
But yeah, but it is purely, conceptual. It's not an empirical argument like you could go out and do a science experiment. So,
yes, yeah. I mean, I would say that the argument that you've shared with us here tonight, and I really appreciate you doing that, by the way. I would say that your argument begins, roughly speaking, as an a posteriori, which is to say an argument rooted in sense experience. But as soon as we get to the point, as soon as we jump off the launch pad and you start hypothesizing about the nature and the characteristics of the non-contingent foundation, I would say that's where we enter. Would you agree with that? I'd say that's where we start entering a priori considerations.
It draws upon a priori conceptual consideration.
Yes.
It was moments after this point in the conversation that the dialogue between Dry Apologist and I came to an end. But as I explained in the opening of this video, we reconvened the following morning. So what you're about to see from this point onwards is the second session where we sat down again to further discuss the contingency argument. So if you have been enjoying the conversation thus far, you're sure to enjoy this second half of the conversation as well. If that's not evidence of a philosophical appetite, I don't know what is. So once again, here's Dry Apologist and I getting into the weeds on the contingency argument after having had a night to sleep on it and think about it and further refine our thoughts. I hope you enjoy it.
So, guys, in a Magic Skeptic podcast first, what's happened here is absolutely fascinating. Dry Apologist and I have such a philosophical appetite that we've actually reconvened the following morning. So we had the conversation you've just watched. We had that yesterday. And after the conversation ended, I was rewatching it. I had additional thoughts. I reached out to Dry Apologist, and we've had another over and back on Twitter, which culminated in a desire to have the conversation continue. Dry Apologist said he's free. I was free. And so we've hopped back on here. And so if there's a discontinuity, if you notice that the set looks a little bit different, or if a background has changed or anything like that, you'll know why. We've actually reconvened because of our intrigue and our interest and our fascination with the argument. And so what I wanted to do, Dry Apologist, first of all, welcome back. What I wanted to do is put another couple of challenges to you about your argument, because I've been thinking a lot about it, and it's given me an immense amount of food for thought. And I've come up with some challenges that we've kind of touched the surface of in our back and forth on Twitter that I'd love my audience to be acquainted with. And so I'm just going to recapitulate the argument I put to you in our Twitter exchange, and you can respond and we'll get into the weeds. I don't imagine this is going to run very long because this is more of an addendum, if you will. But does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, just to recapitulate slightly, your argument begins with the premise that there needs to be a necessary foundation for structured reality, right? And that necessary foundation cannot be either internally or externally limited, right? Now, the point I put to you in the Twitter thread, and the point that I'm going to put to you now, is if indeed it can't be internally or externally limited, you deployed a definition of limited which was purely technical, right? So when I put it to you in the previous section of the conversation, that, well, wouldn't it be a limitation to have a mind? And you said, no. You said, what would be a limitation is to not have a mind. Like in the literal sense, you're deducting something. You're taking a mind away, so that would be a limitation, right? And so you said, no, it would have to have a mind. It would have to be personal, right? And so my thought, and I'm actually just going to pull up the thread here. My thought to you was the following. I'm just going to read this. what I sent to you, just to keep the listener, and I might put this on the screen so they can see the message as well, but this is what I sent to you. I thought of a challenge for your argument about internal and external limitations. So your argument for why the foundation must have a mind is that to not have one would be a limit. By that logic, wouldn't it be necessary for the foundation to also have a body? Not having a body would be a limitation, but this would conflict with immateriality. And I followed on by saying, I think that this is a strong objection. You responded, or do you know what? Do you want me to read your response, or would you rather respond here now? What would you rather do, Dry Apologist?
Yeah. Well, I'll just summarize it. So what I had said back to you was that, yeah, so any feature or property, and I'm using those to mean the same thing, that requires a limit in order to exist wouldn't be something the foundation could have. So like in our last discussion, I said, like, could it be made of wood? And I said no, because being made of wood would require being limited by space. So having a body, I would view that as, that has to require space. So it would be able to have a body, but I don't view a mind as something that requires to be within space. So that, and now some people might say, well, does a mind have to be within time? I would still say no, but it does depend upon one's view of, that does get into questions about causality and such, but yeah, go ahead.
Yes, so I think this is actually, and the reason I wanted to reconvene, and I'm hoping the listeners will find this peculiar at the very least, but I hope they will be not moved, but I hope they will be regaled by the fact that you and I are so fascinated by this dialogue that we actually reconvened. I think that shows an immense amount of goodwill on your part and my part, and it also shows an immense amount of genuine interest in the conversation. But I actually think this might be the rock bottom of our disagreement, Dry Apologist, because if you're saying that any feature or property that itself requires a limit in order to exist, and there, of course, you're referring to a body, you're saying that to have a body would be a limit, and so the foundation wouldn't have a body as a consequence. You're saying that, therefore, the foundation cannot have a body, right? And then my response to you is this would include a mind, which debunks the whole argument. And then I said, of course, you'll argue for a kind of dualism, and in my view, that's conjecture. So really what we have here, Dry Apologist, is this. This is my summation of the argument and where we're at, and then we can get into the weeds on this. You're alleging that the foundation of reality is limitless, right? And that's because whatever caused space and time would be, I'm on board with whatever caused space and time, if indeed it had a cause. We discussed all the rest of that yesterday, so we won't get into that again. If indeed space-time had a cause, a non-contingent cause, it would make sense for that cause to be spaceless, because it exists outside of space and time. It would make sense for that to be timeless, because it exists outside of space and time. And it would make sense for it to be immaterial, because it exists before and outside of materiality, right? The place where, as I clarified in the previous conversation, the place where we part ways is when you say that it would also be personal, that it would have a mind. And of course, your argument was to not have a mind would be a limit. My response is not having a body would also be a limit. And your response to that was, no, having a body would actually be limited. So anything that would limit the foundation, the foundation couldn't possibly have, so it couldn't have a body. But then, of course, the elephant in the room, and I realized this while reflecting on your argument, is that, and this came up in part in our previous conversation and dialogue, but there is no evidence of minds existing absent a physical body. So if you're going to say it doesn't have a body, the foundation doesn't have a body because that would be a limit, then by extension, to my mind, as an atheist and a non-dualist, I'm not convinced dualism is true. Dualism, for the listeners who aren't aware, is the idea that there are two substances. Perhaps Dry Apologist can confirm whether or not he identifies specifically as a dualist or some maybe form of monism, or I'm not sure. But suffice to say, you're believing in the idea that the mind can exist as its own separate substance, a non-physical substance separate from a physical body. I don't buy that. I don't think there's any evidence for that. So if you're going to say that the foundation cannot have anything, that would include a limit, and that would include it wouldn't have a body. well, then I hear that and I think, well, then it also couldn't possibly have a mind, because there's no evidence that minds can exist absent a brain or a body more generally, right? Minds not only can't exist absent a brain, I would say, but they also can't exist absent blood flow, because a brain relies on blood flow, oxygenated blood, and all those extrinsic factors that go into a functioning brain. So that's what I'd like you to respond to, Dry Apologist, because I think this really is the bedrock of our disagreement. You say the foundation cannot have any limits, and so therefore it cannot have a body. But my contention is, if it cannot have a body, it cannot possibly have a mind. And if it cannot have a mind, Dry Apologist, given my understanding, if it cannot have a mind, it cannot possibly be personal, and it cannot possibly be agent-like, in that it has thoughts, emotions like compassion that you referred to in our previous dialogue. So I want to give you a chance to respond, my friend. Go for it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. So I would say, I am committed to a kind of dualism, but I'm not, the specifics of it I'm kind of open-minded about. I'm not necessarily committed to like substance dualism about the human person per se, but that's a different topic. But yeah, God would be an immaterial mind, he wouldn't have a brain and such. So the way I would respond to that is, so for human persons, I mean, I agree, like if we have brain damage, it's going to affect our mind and so on, and there is a kind of dependence, or at least interrelation between the mind and the brain, and we have a lot of evidence for that, of course. But I would also argue correlation doesn't entail causation. So like, you could damage the brain, and yes, it does affect the mind, but that could just be a contingent interrelation. It doesn't necessarily mean the mind depends upon the brain. So that'll get into, interpretations of that. But setting that aside, because I mean, God, it could be that we're purely physical, but God is still an immaterial mind. So getting into the nature of God, I mean, it's kind of going to get back into our example about like the unicorn. So like, is it logically possible for there to be a mind that doesn't depend upon a brain? Well, it does seem like it's logically possible to my mind, unless, you bring forth an argument that we can look at. But I would then say it's logically possible, and to me, it seems like it's necessary for the foundation to lack all limits. So it's then going to, and if that entails also being a mind, then it's going to deductively follow, in my estimation, unless there's a logical impossibility. So I don't think I'm going to need to have empirical evidence per se, because it's not an empirically founded argument. It's as we were saying, it's at least partially a priori. So it's going to come down to those conceptual deductions. So that's how I would respond.
Yeah, so I'm really happy we've reconvened. For the sake of the completeness of the discussion, I'm really happy that we've reconvened, and because this, I really do believe it. I think this is the rock bottom of our disagreement, Dry Apologist. So essentially, your view is that, given your kind of speculations as to what this foundation would include, you're essentially planting a flag in the sand here. By your own admission, you don't have any empirical evidence. You're making an a priori assertion, if you will, rooted in speculation, that there must be some kind of an immaterial mind. And that, to me, Dry Apologist, is incoherent for a number of reasons, some of which you've already inferred. It doesn't make sense, first of all, given the empirical front, where we have no evidence of minds absent brains and physical bodies. But it also doesn't make sense in terms of, and again, you inferred this a moment ago, but how a mind could exist outside of space and time. Right? Even if I granted immaterial minds, even if I granted that for a moment, for something to exist outside of space and time, that's a paradox as far as I can tell. Because if something exists, it exists in some, like, presumably that mind experienced moments. So there was a moment where it decided to create the reality, for example, but then there was an infinity of moments before that moment where the reality was created. When I say moment there, I'm obviously referring to temporal events, but by your own admission, this thing, this entity, this immaterial mind exists outside of space and time. That to me sounds just completely incoherent. You might as well, pardon me, you might as well be describing a square circle. I think there is some grounds here for a priori illogicality, although you might say it's logically possible. Maybe I shouldn't make such a bombastic claim and say that it's a priori in terms of its illogicality. Maybe I shouldn't say that, and let's table that for a moment. I guess I am just making a comment about something that I view as incoherent. How could it exist and have experiences if there's no time in which those experiences are occurring? And how could it be having experiences if there's no space in which those experiences are occurring? These, to my mind, seem like insurmountable problems for your position, and it requires an immense amount of faith in order to take that seriously based on mere speculation. Do you see where I'm coming from there? Do you see why someone like me would have those concerns? I'm assuming you've heard these concerns articulated to you in the past.
Yeah, so I get where you're coming from. So in regards to the spatial aspect, so in terms of any sort of sensory requirement that would require like I can see something outside of me or hear something outside of me, yeah, God wouldn't have an experience like that because he's not within space under this view. But I don't think that all thought and experience requires being in space. Like if I'm contemplating 1 + 1 = 2, or the proposition like I'm talking to you right now, that doesn't seem to require being within space. It's more just an intellectual apprehension. So I would say that a mind doesn't have to be within space to have thoughts. But in regards to time, I agree it's a little bit trickier. So it does depend upon the interpretation of time. So this will get into philosophy of time, but like if a B theory or sometimes called eternalism is true, so all moments of time are equally present across the timeline, or not present, but equally coexistent across the timeline, and God is sustaining that timeline, then he would be intellectually aware or apprehending all moments of time at once. So he would see, we're having this conversation. He would also see the world is being created. He'd also see, other stuff that would be future to us all at once. So that's my preferred view of God, that he's outside of time and he's apprehending all moments of time at once. Now, if one doesn't take that view of time, although it is a commonly held view of time within physics and philosophy of time, and they take what's called presentism, or sometimes associated with an A theory, so that moments actually do arise, new moments come about, only the present exists, and then there's going to be a future moment and a next moment and a next moment, then God would be, it would seem, experientially sensing these new moments coming about. So his awareness, you could say, is within time in a sense, but he wouldn't be encapsulated by time. It wouldn't exist like around him in the way like we're within space and we're receiving these moments. He'd be more standing outside as a bystander, seeing the moments come about. So that's what I was saying. When we say God is outside of time, it does depend upon what one means by that. So the argument at most, I think, commits to that God is not surrounded by space and time. But I do prefer that B theory, eternalist type view, where God is immediately seeing all moments co-present. And I think, though, if one grants so that he's not encapsulated by space and time, that would be enough. And then it would come down to how does one interpret the implications of that? But basically, I think that there is some room for interpretation to still allow for a mind to exist outside of space and time.
Do you not, pardon me, do you not concede, Dry Apologist, that you are firmly within the realm of rather extravagant speculation there? Would you not concede that?
I could concede it. I guess it just depends upon what one means by that and if they think that's problematic. Like, I think that if somebody is wanting to take a metaphysical type interpretation of reality and they're wanting to think, I mean, obviously one could say, well, they just don't know, and they're happy with just sitting there with, I don't know, and they're not going to enter into that, and that might be where you're at. But if one's wanting to say, okay, what do I think seems like the most plausible interpretation of reality, and I'm okay entering into this a priori conceptual realm and saying like, not with certainty, but saying this seems to be the plausible interpretation, then I mean, I'm fine with entering into that. But if somebody's saying, I'm not going to do that, then yeah, it depends upon what you're comfortable with, I guess.
See, that would be fine if we were just talking about classroom speculation and hypothesizing about the nature of reality. I'm totally comfortable with doing that as well. We're doing it right now. The difference between us dry apologists is that I don't know much about your life outside of what you've already told me, but I know that you're a Catholic, and so to one extent or another, you've based your life on this. And so these kinds of speculations aren't just mere, academic intrigue for you. You genuinely believe that there is a necessary foundation that is immaterial and yet somehow has a mind, even though there's no evidence of minds absent a brain. And you believe that that mind exists outside of space and time. And I appreciate hearing your thoughts about different theories of time and so forth. But again, by your own admission, you conceded that you're firmly in the realm of a priori speculation. And yet you're basing your life on this. I mean, I used this analogy in our previous conversation, but if I went into the doctor's office and the doctor was speculating a priori about which medicine to give me, I wouldn't go back to that doctor. So my question to you, moving aside slightly, is there anything else in your life, practically speaking, is there anything else you believe, or any activity, or any medicine, or is there anything that you would accept on the basis of these kind of a priori speculations? Now, I'm not talking about philosophical things, because you've already pointed out that, you speculate a priori about different theories of time and so on. I just mean at a practical level. Like, would you ever accept a doctor prescribing you a medicine based on purely a priori considerations? Because my suspicion is that isn't something you would do, and that when it comes to the real practical stuff in life, you would want to know that it was based on rigorous empirical a posteriori, that is to say, sense experience and evidential procedure and robust investigation. Like, I guess what I'm driving at is there not an inconsistency in your epistemology and your belief system, dry apologist, in that you're willing to speculate, in my view, to, forgive me now for saying it this way, and I don't mean to offend you, but the speculations you're engaging in are extravagant, I would say, from my perspective as a skeptic, not just an atheist, but as a skeptic. I feel like the speculations are rather extravagant. And I'm suspecting that there would actually be a disconnect in terms of other things in your life. Now, that's an allegation I've just made against you, so I want to give you a chance to respond to that allegation. Do you think there's any merit to that allegation, or do I just have you completely wrong?
So I think it depends upon the matter. So, like, if I'm going to the doctor, they're dealing with contingent physical type sensory considerations that we do need some empirical evidence to confirm if that's the proper result of the physical world. Like, does this medicine result in this effect? Does this procedure result in this effect? And such, and we're going to trust, the probabilities of, they've done the research and such. But if we're dealing with conceptual matters that are a priori, are, analytical, so it, like mathematics or morality, at least to some degree, I would say are prior, conceptual, and then it is going to be purely a priori. And also, like I was saying, the cogito, like, I think I definitely exist, even if my reality is totally not what I think it is. I definitely exist because of this a priori argument from, we talked about yesterday, the cogito. So there are some things that, and if there were other good arguments that somebody can bring, there just aren't very many within philosophy that are a priori. But if there are, definitely, like, for example, I know there are no, now this is a little bit of wordplay, I know there are no married bachelors because it's just incoherent, but I know that's a little bit of wordplay.
It's a tautology, yeah. That's a purely analytic statement. It's like saying X is X.
Well, kind of. I mean, there is a little bit of deduction involved, but yeah, it depends. It's how we define the words.
Well, if a bachelor is defined as an unmarried male, saying that there are no married, or if a bachelor is defined as an unmarried male, saying that there are no married bachelors is a tautology. It's no different from saying A is equal to A. I'm surprised you pushed back on that.
Well, I push back on it because I'm not sure that it's technically a tautology. I'd have to look at, because a tautology meaning like a statement that just is a circular like reaffirmation, because you do have to make some deduction about like and assume the law of non-contradiction and such. That I'm not sure if it's a tautology, but I don't want to get into a debate about that.
Okay,
but the point is though, there are some a priori considerations that. So basically, it depends upon what domain we're dealing with. If we're dealing with an investigation of the physical world and how it manifests, then we need some empirical evidence. But if we're dealing with purely conceptual deductive inferences, then I don't think we do. It's just that it's a case by case type of situation.
And this is why I think one of the reasons why I'm an atheist, because a lot, not all of them, but a lot of the arguments for God's existence deal in this kind of domain, the a priori. There are notable exceptions, the design argument and things like that, which we could get into perhaps another time. But when you're talking about ontological arguments and arguments for God's existence that are based purely in logical conjecture, I'm not convinced, as I said, that logic can necessarily tell us what's in reality. You keep mentioning the cogito, Descartes. That might be the one notable exception, but that said, there is a debate about whether or not that really is truly an a priori conclusion, given the fact that it involves actual experience, experience which is a posteriori. But that's a debate which I don't think is necessarily pertinent right now. Given the fact that you've referred to it a number of times, it would seem to me that there's probably not very many other examples that could necessarily be pointed to. My point is that as a general maxim, it doesn't seem that logic alone can produce knowledge about what exists in terms of reality, like what exists. So you can talk about numbers and things like that, but what I'm saying is I often use the example of if I'm in a dark room with no windows and no doors and I can't see outside the room, logic is never going to get me to what's outside the room. I could never possibly use logic to figure out what's outside the room. The only way I could know, and I'm not the first philosopher to notice this, obviously, and I know you're going to disagree, dry apologist, but many philosophers, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here, would say that analytic philosophy or a priori reasoning can't lead to knowledge about what's in quote unquote the real world. And the God you believe in manifests in the real world in numerous ways. We already spoke about this. He sent his only begotten son. He answers prayer. He created the universe. He created life. He's, according to you, continuously sustaining reality. And this is where I think that I'm tempted to accuse you of engaging in special pleading, because in every other domain of your life, with the cogito exempted, you do use empirical evidence and data to make your decisions. You look both ways before you cross the road. You want to know that the doctor is using evidence to give you the medicine. All the rest of it, right? You wouldn't get into a car that the engine was smoking because you'd be worried. The evidence would be such that you'd be concerned about that. There's an immense amount of, stuff in our lives where we use evidence, and then we come to the most important question about whether or not there's a God. And then you're saying, oh, but that's, not necessarily an empirical domain, and we have to talk about a priori speculations. And I just feel like that is not... maybe special pleading is the wrong phrase, but you seem to be exempting the most important belief in your life from empirical demands. What say you?
Yeah, so, well, so it's not necessarily that I exempt it, because it's just in this argument, because obviously I'm also, part of my belief is going to draw upon perhaps some empirical, for me at least, like in terms of experience, religious experience and such. But setting that aside, just looking at this argument and treating it on its own, I would say that, because I mean, if I'm investigating the the physical world, that's going to be a different domain. So I know that things can result with have different results and such, but I am still a priori bringing in the fact that I accept induction, the fact that I accept the applicability of mathematics. Those are just starting points that I think that those are applicable, and logic is applicable to the external world. So I would say that those are a priori in my acceptance of the external world too. I would say is that those are a priori assumptions that I bring to the table. I already accept, but since we know that the physical world can have different results and such, we want to do testing to say, well, what's the probability of this? So like, what's the likelihood if a car is smoking, what that means? And we may not be with certainty, but it's to say, well, the probabilities point towards, the engine's not working right and such. But to me, that's a different domain than if we're dealing with a priori conceptualizations about the nature of reality. So to me, they're just two separate domains. And there aren't very many examples, but that doesn't mean that in principle one can't engage in a priori, because like I would say metaphysics is always at least in part engaging in the a priori. And I know some people don't like metaphysics or don't trust it or whatever, that's fine. But if somebody does want to reach a metaphysical conclusion, like what's the nature of something, if we're talking about free will or the nature of the mind or the existence of God or the nature of time, they're going to have to bring some, at least a priori considerations, I think. And I think that's totally legitimate. And I think it's something that is worthwhile doing. And again, I don't know that you can reach a certain conclusion, but I think you can reach what you take at least to be a probable conclusion. And I just don't have a problem with you doing that.
Yeah, so I think that really is the difference between us. And just to kind of summarize for the listeners, the difference is, and correct me if I misspeak, I don't want to put words in your mouth, dry apologist, but the difference between us is that your view, you're willing to believe things on the basis, at least with respect to this specific argument. I really do want to talk to you about religious experience another time. But at least with respect to this argument, you're willing to believe what I would call rather extravagant things based on logical speculation. And I'm not. I think, would you say that that's the difference between us? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that could be a fair summary. That oftentimes is what I think is a disagreement, and it doesn't often get brought out because some of these arguments could be complex and such. But yeah, I think that there can be an epistemic disagreement, and I don't think it's just between atheists and theists. I think it can be with amongst atheists and amongst theists, where there is a different epistemic starting point. Because I'll talk to some Christians, and they'll probably tell me, well, that argument doesn't appeal, like the argument that I'm presenting just doesn't appeal to them because they just don't like engaging in that kind of, like they tend to be more wanting empirical type basis, so they might be more attracted to like design arguments or religious experience, and they don't want to get into conceptualizations. And so, yeah, I think that the epistemic attractions, or what one place warrant in terms of like what you can use to reach a likely or acceptable conclusion as such, does affect the examination. So if we're looking at like a contingency argument, if somebody doesn't accept or doesn't, whatever, however you want to phrase it, doesn't like the more a priori, then yeah, I mean, they're going to that's going to be perhaps a hang up for them. So I agree, yeah, when the epistemic considerations does affect how much credence one puts in the argument.
Yeah, for sure. And not to I mean, I don't mean to be rude, but it just feels to me that if there were really solid physical empirical evidence for the God you believe in, then you wouldn't be concerning yourself with these arguments. Now, I'm not accusing you of being disingenuous. Of course not. One of the reasons I brought you on is because, as I keep saying, I view you as an honest operator. But it just feels like you have to resort to these kinds of arguments. Now, maybe you are a proponent of the design argument, and maybe we can discuss that in another podcast. But it just seems like these kind of speculative, a priori logical arguments are Yeah, I mean, you're willing to believe, you're willing to accept the conclusions of these speculations, at least in part. It's not that you have certainty or anything, but you're willing to use them as confirmation for your belief in God, whereas I would never. And just in terms of perhaps a closing statement of sorts here, to summarize my position here, I think there are incoherencies in the argument that you've presented. I think it is incoherent to say that that the foundation of reality, the foundation of structured reality, as you put it, I think it's incoherent to say that that thing cannot have any limits, and then also say that it has a mind. You're willing to say it can't have a body because a body would be limited, but my problem is that the mind and the body are intimately connected, and we have no evidence to the contrary. You did say a moment ago that minds can be spaceless, and I must admit that didn't make sense to me. It just sounded like an assertion. You can respond to all of this, of course, after I've wrapped up my comment here. But yeah, it seems incoherent to me to say that there is a spaceless and immaterial mind, especially when one of your tenets for establishing the nature of this foundation is that it has to have no limits. I would say that minds are, every place we find a mind, it's connected to a brain, and you've already ruled out the possibility of this foundation having a body, and I would argue by extension you've shot yourself in the foot and ruled out the possibility of this thing having a mind. And so it cannot possibly be a personal agent-like thinking entity that has thoughts and emotions and a viewpoint and compassion and kindness and love and all those attributes that you might call the divine qualities. I think there's a real problem in your argument there. And I haven't even gotten on to the other things. You walled off the omnis conversation, but if indeed this being has no limits, that means it's all powerful. And that does produce paradoxes. Can God lift a rock that's so heavy he can't, or can God create a rock rather that's so heavy he can't lift it? There are complications there as well. And I just feel like by asserting through this speculation that the foundation of reality has to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and personal, I think it undoes itself in the calamity that's produced. Minds don't exist absent a brain, or at least that's what the evidence tells us. That's what the evidence tells us. And so for you to assert the opposite, whilst saying so purely in the realm of a priori, my conclusion is I need more than an a priori speculation that the mind can exist absent a physical body. I would need more than that. It sounds like you don't. You're happy to believe that a mind can exist in an immaterial state, absent a body. You're happy to believe that based on logical speculation. And my epistemology does not allow for that. I think that is irrational, to put it bluntly. But go ahead, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the charge of irrational is going to be hard to substantiate because it's going to depend upon, how you define. So it might be irrational based on your definition of irrational, but then if I'm using a different one, and then that's going to go down the rabbit hole. But
should I give you my definition just to be clear? Should I give you my definition? Just because it's a totally fair response. When I say irrational, I'm saying that what I mean by that is you don't have empirical justification. Now, you're going to say, of course, but you feel like you have a priori justification. And again, we're back to our epistemic difference, right? Where you're willing to believe something based on logical speculation, and I'm not willing to believe something based on logical speculation. To believe something as grandiose as a mind existing outside of space and time, to believe that an immaterial mind, to believe that, I would require more than a priori logical speculation. I would want physical evidence. And you might say, but that's a contradiction. And I'm going to respond and say all the things that I've already said, which is to say that your God trespasses explicitly into the domain of the empirical, given the God that you believe in, the interventionist God that answers prayers, that created reality, that created life, that sustains the universe continuously. right? I would say that we should expect to find empirical evidence of such an entity. Now, you might say there is in terms of the design argument, and perhaps what we're going to get to in this conversation in closing is that we need to have another conversation about an empirical argument, which I'm going to find much more persuasive in terms of its possibility of convincing me or changing my mind. But sorry for the interjection, my friend. I just wanted to clarify, because you're absolutely right to call me on the definition of irrationality. I just wanted to wear my definition on my sleeve and make sure that you knew where I was coming from there. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I tend to avoid saying a position is irrational because it does depend upon how one defines that. But I mean, if somebody requires empirical evidence to believe something, then sure. But in regards to your objection though, in regards to like a mind not being able to exist in space and time, I mean that would be an a priori objection though. So you are, to me, my estimation, it seems like, well, if you're charging incoherence, it would be. Now, if you're saying well, you just don't have evidence for it, then sure, but that wouldn't be a proof. That would just be saying you don't have a sufficient degree of evidence. So, but that wouldn't make it incoherent, though. So I just want to separate those two types of objections. So if you're saying it's incoherent,
sorry, finish your talk. Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that's actually a fair comment. But yeah, please proceed.
Right. So I'm not convinced that there's anything incoherent about a spaceless, timeless mind, although there are some who will argue that it is. But, that's one issue. But then the other issue is, do we have evidence of such a thing? And I would just say our evidence is underdetermined, meaning we just don't have, we have considerations, we have empirical considerations, and then there are interpretations. Like I have friends who are idealists, and they think there actually is no real external world. That it's actually in our minds, and it's kind of like we're in the Matrix, but not that we're literally in the Matrix, but that the external world is actually purely in our minds, and they'll say the evidence is just underdetermined, and idealism is the best interpretation of the mind-body problem. I intuitively just disagree with that. I think there is a real external world. I think idealism just doesn't seem correct to me, but I couldn't definitively disprove it necessarily. It just doesn't seem the best interpretation. And then so it does get into, there is certainly a correlation between the mind, for us at least, for the mind, between the mind and the brain. There's a causal correlation, but that doesn't necessarily entail that the mind depends upon the brain for its existence. And, that gets into the mind-body problem. But even if that is the case for us, even if God has created the world, that our minds do depend upon our brain, that wouldn't follow that God needs a brain in order to exist, or that God needs space in order to exist. So I do think the empirical evidence that we have about minds, I think it's just underdetermined. It just doesn't tell us one way or another, and we engage in interpretations, and then we do have to enter into the a priori speculation. And if somebody says they're just uncertain or they just don't find that attractive or whatever, that's fine. But I do find it attractive, and I think that we can do that. So it does come back to one's epistemic starting points of what they find to be an acceptable approach. But
yes,
yeah,
there is. I mean, I agree with you that all we have is a correlation between brain and mind. But the difference between us, dry apologist, the difference between us, and you're saying that the evidence is underdetermined, right? The difference between us is that all I believe about the mind is that it correlates with the brain. I'm not making any claim here that the mind and consciousness more broadly is just a product of the brain. Now, I'm sympathetic to that view because I'm sympathetic to naturalism, but my official position is I'm not sure. There's a reason we call it the hard problem of consciousness, right? I mean, consciousness is a mystery to one extent or another. How consciousness emerges from matter, or if it only emerges from matter, these are open questions. The difference between us is that I'm saying the only evidence we have is that minds are connected to brains, right? That there's a strong correlation there. And then that's where it ends for me. But you're using the fact that the evidence is underdetermined, it seems to me, to your advantage. You're saying it's underdetermined, so maybe the mind could exist in an immaterial reality. Maybe the mind could exist absent a brain. Those are purely, I would say, extravagant speculations, right? Whereas I'm saying, which I think to be the only real answer, the only acceptable answer now, is that we don't know, right? And when I say we don't know, I mean just we're unsure, right? I don't think you have epistemic warrant. I don't think you have a justification based on your speculations and based on the fact that the evidence is underdetermined. I don't think you have a justification at all to believe that a mind can exist absent a brain. If the evidence is underdetermined, then you should suspend judgment. That's my feeling, right? Yeah, I mean, I've written down a lot of things here. I just want to be clear, by the way, I'm perhaps a bit liberal with words. And so when I used the charge of incoherent earlier, you were right to call me out in that. Sometimes just the usage of words is different, and I'm a big believer in words have meanings, or rather words have usages rather than meanings. And so, you know, there's not necessarily a logical contradiction in your position, to be fair. I'm always coming from that more empirical point of view, as I've already explained. And as we've already clarified, the difference between us is that you're, at least with respect to this argument, you're willing to believe that an immaterial mind can exist based on a priori considerations. And I'm not willing to believe that a mind like that can exist because I see no evidence, physical evidence for that. And yeah, I mean, I mean, perhaps now we're starting to go in a circle, but one other thing to make, just to put on the table, I just want people to be aware of this. You mentioned about your friends who believe that the world is just a product of the mind. They're solipsists of one type or another.
Well, idealists.
Idealists, yes. So they think that the world is there's not really an external world, right? Now, you said you can't disprove that. And I can't disprove it either. But I think that's just a basic burden of proof issue. If they believe that, it's on them to prove that it's the case. I actually don't think there's any philosophical problem at all with rejecting their belief there. I don't have to disprove it. I can just suspend judgment on that question, and they can try and, you know, make their case. I don't think anybody has ever substantiated the case that we are in fact in a matrix or anything of that nature. And I feel, and you know, just to be clear, they can make all the same claims that you make. Oh, well, you know, it's not logically impossible, and, you know, speculation can get us to there. And yeah, sure, of course, I'm on board there in terms of the logic of it. But it just comes back to, I think, the fundamental difference between us is that some people are willing to believe things based on a priori speculation, and other people aren't willing to believe things based on a priori speculation. To believe what I would say is a worldview altering proposition, like there is a God, or that there is an immaterial mind, or that reality isn't real, to believe something like that, for someone like me, requires more than a priori speculation. Do you at least understand? Do you have any sympathy for that perspective? I'm assuming you've met lots of people like this. I don't know. Would you call me an empiricist? Would you call me an evidentialist? How would you respond to that? I'm assuming you've met people like me before who feel this way. Are you sympathetic at all to the view? Or do you just view everything I've said as being too narrow-minded? I'm just intrigued, you know, in terms of what your response to a thinker like me, like what would your response to a thinker like me actually be?
Yeah, well, I am sympathetic to some degree because, like, I reject idealism, but that is because I have, at least to me, this a priori acceptance of the external world. It's just a starting point that the external world seems real, and I accept that. And they reject that starting point, I guess, based on their idealism. And that to me is just, it rejects a starting point that I have that I'm committed to. So, but that's where I would say that maybe, you know, your acceptance of the external world is a kind of a priori starting point for you. And I embrace that. And when somebody rejects that, I think that I just don't share that. I'm not comfortable rejecting that. So, but I am comfortable accepting a priori conceptualizations about, you know, metaphysics and such. So it kind of then, to my mind, it kind of comes down to what one's starting points are and what they're willing to embrace as legitimate starting points. So you're saying, well, they have the idealist has the burden of proof, but you know what they're going to say? No, their position's simpler. We have the burden of proof to convince them there really is an external world. So Yeah, burden of proof. I tend to not get that interested in debating about. I think whoever makes the claim has the burden of proof for their argument. If they're given the starting argument, they need to give reasons for why they hold that position. But in terms of who ultimately has the burden of proof about their view, yeah, it just depends on who's making the claim basically. But I don't think that idealism can be ruled out as like irrational or whatever. I just don't accept the intuition about it.
It's unfalsifiable.
Yeah.
Right.
It's unfalsifiable if one rejects the intuition that there really is an external world. But since I accept that intuition, to me, it is falsifiable. But for them, it's not. So but it does depend upon one's starting points. Now, if somebody could show a logical contradiction with idealism, and there are some arguments that one could bring to the table, arguing like, well, actually, it's logically contradictory, then that would be a really good argument against it. But that would be purely a priori. Now, I don't have a knockdown logical argument against it, but if I did, I could bring that to the table. But I'm comfortable bringing these a priori objections and a priori positive arguments. But if you're not, and you're say, look, no, we can't go that route, I think you're kind of cutting yourself off to access to types of reasonings. But then I think that maybe you're being inconsistent in embracing, well, there is an external world, there is a past, induction is reliable, logic is reliable to at least to some degree. Those to me are a priori commitments that you've chosen to embrace, and I agree with them. But I'm willing to take it a step further and say, okay, well, we could apply this.
I just forgive me for laughing.
It's fine.
No, this is actually really good because I feel, and again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I feel like there's memes. We've entered meme territory here in terms of the conversation, and we spoke off air about memes and people sending you memes on Twitter to try and debunk you and so on. But there is that meme of the Christian apologist, you, saying to the atheist, well, you can't prove reality is real, therefore I'm entitled to believe in God. And that's that's not obviously the fairest summary of your position, but if you really break down what you've just said there, dry apologist, to one extent or another, you're saying that I'm being inconsistent because I believe in a real reality, and that's a kind of an a priori commitment, and yet I don't believe in God along a priori lines, and so therefore I'm being inconsistent. The problem I have with that, and the problem many atheists who are probably screaming at the screen right now after you've said that, the problem with that is that I actually have no choice, I would argue. Not no choice in the strictest sense of the phrase. Even your friends who are idealists, they still get out of bed in the morning, I assume. They still go to their job. They still work. They still eat. They still drink. They still make love and, have romantic partners. And they still do all those things. Because
idealists don't have romantic partners.
I appreciate your sense of humor. Shout out to all the idealists out there. But yeah, the point is, those people still go about and live their lives because they have no choice to. They have no choice but to. The fact of the matter is, whether this world is real or not, we're stuck with it. I'm stuck and confined within this reality, and this reality appears to operate according to certain rules. It appears to operate according to a kind of scientific method. Some things appear to be falsifiable, other things don't appear to be falsifiable. It seems to cohere to certain physical laws. You'll attribute all of this to God, of course. My point is that I have no choice but to navigate the world in which I am stuck. Whether it's real or not is actually not relevant in that sense, because I still have to eat. I still have to go eat breakfast. I still have to do that. And you have to do it too. And so does the idealist. So we all have to do that. You're adding something extra. That's my problem. Now, you'll dispute that and you'll say, no, in fact, God is just, all you need is God and then everything else follows, right? But the truth is we're stuck here in this, what appears to be a physical reality, and you're speculating on the basis of logic and a priori reasoning. At least with respect to this argument, you're speculating that there is a God that grounds it all, an immaterial mind. And we won't go back over all the immaterial mind ground, because I think we've said enough that the listener can make up their own minds. But just to close the loop on this, charge of inconsistency in my position, I actually, truth be told, don't have a strong view on external reality. I don't think, and I would say it's the problem of hard solipsism. I don't think it's possible to prove the external world without reference to the external world, and so it just ends up being a vicious circle. It's kind of like the problem of induction. You can't prove induction because it requires using induction, right? Christians will often charge the scientific method with that. The scientific method can't prove itself. And then all you can do is appeal to the fact that, but it works. But then that's a vicious circle because there's a problem of induction there and circular reasoning. I'm not saying that there aren't real, meaty philosophical problems that are on the table. And yeah, I do have to assume certain things when I get out of bed in the morning. My view is that you're assuming something extra, dry apologist. You're assuming something extra that I'm not assuming, and you're assuming it on the basis of an a priori speculation that, to my mind, doesn't rise to the level of justified true belief. I couldn't possibly believe that there's an immaterial mind based on a priori speculation. I would need something more than that. If that makes me inconsistent, then I'm inconsistent. But I would argue, I would respond, and I would say quite strongly that the fact that I can't prove the external world is a problem that's shared by all, and we have no choice but to get out of bed in the morning and go eat. And so we're stuck with it. Whereas we don't have to get out of the bed in the morning and go to church. We don't have to get out of bed in the morning and believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, immaterial mind that grounds reality. But yeah, go ahead.
And that reminds me, I did want to respond earlier. You said about the omnis. Yeah, I think this argument that I'm offering does commit to an omni God, but I just wanted to flag it earlier just in case you pushed back on arguing that it didn't or whatever. But yeah, and I agree there are some conceptual paradoxes that need to be addressed if somebody's getting into talking about omnis. And I think that they are consistent, but that's a whole nother can of worms. But
for another day, my friend.
Right. Now, yeah, I do have to get going in a few minutes. But
no, I was thinking that we were naturally coming to a close. Yeah. But please take some time to collect your thoughts.
Well, just real quick. So I don't necessarily think that you're inconsistent in accepting the external world, but then like rejecting a contingency argument. And people can choose what principles they find plausible. It's just I think it might be inconsistent if you say if you don't engage in the a priori at all, or that has no weight for you, because I think it could just be purely pragmatic, but I think we all bring some a priori commitments, and I'm saying that engaging in metaphysical speculation is an a priori consideration that I bring that I'm comfortable with, but somebody else could say that they're not, and that's fine. But I'm just saying though that we all engage in a priori to some degree. It's just how much weight you put. And somebody could say they're totally agnostic if there's an external world or not. I'm not comfortable taking that view. I really believe there is an external world, and I think I'm justified in believing it. So I'm just saying, though, it gets tricky, and where one says what one is justified in or not, it's really tricky to say that. I mean, there are some views that I think are not justified, like if somebody accepts induction, but then they don't accept induction when it entails a scientific commitment that they don't like. That to me is inconsistent, and that's why like some fringe scientific views, I think we would say, well, that's irrational. But I think the reason why it's irrational is because that person accepts induction, except when it reaches conclusions they don't like. Now, I'm not saying that's what you're doing here. I'm saying though that that's why something like flat Earth is at least plausibly irrational. And I gotta say plausibly because
now those are lonely people.
Right. And I say plausibly because it is still a judgment that I'm making about that. But I think that they accept induction. But I think if they were really careful, I think if they were really applying induction and such fairly, they would not believe in a flat Earth. So I think they're probably, it seems, being inconsistent. Now, I'm not saying you're being inconsistent. It's just I think to say a view is not justified or irrational or something, I think somebody would have to show that somebody's being inconsistent with their own methodology. And I don't think I am. It's just that it then comes down to what one accepts as a acceptable epistemology. And ultimately, we may have a disagreement on what's an acceptable epistemology. And
absolutely,
I think that's okay. But yeah, I think that
yep.
could be the root of our disagreement. And then, of course, there are other considerations like design arguments and religious experience and so on. And yeah, those things can factor in for me as well. So yeah, I think that kind of summarizes a lot of what we talked about.
Yeah, and I'm happy for that to be the last word, my friend. And I think the listeners have enough that they can make up their own minds. I'm incredibly grateful that you've joined me again here this morning, or at least I'm not so sure what time it is in your time zone, but I'm really, really happy that you joined me here again today, Dry Apologist. I hope that the listeners will have appreciated our philosophical enthusiasm, that we actually reconvened to discuss this matter once again. I think they're going to get a lot out of it. And I just have to say kudos to you. Thank you very much for joining me now twice at this stage. I really enjoyed this follow-up conversation. As I said to you in the Twitter exchange, I had a lot of additional thoughts, and I'm incredibly grateful that you've joined me here again today. So thanks very much, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Dry Apologist for joining me in today's discussion. It was a fascinating one, and I can't wait to do it again. I'd also like to thank you, dear listener, for getting to the end of this dialogue. This was quite a heavy conversation, quite lengthy, and it got very technical and complex in different places, and so kudos to you for getting to the end of the conversation. And now, speaking of you, dear listener, it's over to you. What do you think? Did I do a good job defending the atheist position? Were there any weaknesses in my case? Could I have done better in various areas? And similarly with Dry Apologist, do you think his argument was a strong one? What would you say? Jump into the comments below and let us know your thoughts. The best thing about my channel is that the conversation often continues for weeks on end in the comments below, and I can't wait, more so than any video I've done recently, I can't wait to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments below. I want to know how you think I got on. I want to know where you think the weaknesses were in his arguments versus my arguments, and who you think ultimately came out on top. Other than that, guys, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you drop a like on it. And if it is your first time visiting the channel and you're not subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, make sure you check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be able to stay up to date with all things on the channel, and you'll even be notified as and when my latest videos go live. Other than that, I want to extend an extra special thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and support means the world to me. I'm just continuously flummoxed by how much you guys support me, and just thank you so much. If you want to become a patron like those I just mentioned, you'll find the link in the description box below. You can sign up for as little as £3 per month, and you'll gain access to a plethora of perks and awesome extras. So guys, once again, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye bye.